President, as an outsider to this process and to this body, we get to major issues like this, I really become very troubled. What we're trying to do today is historic. What we've been trying to do all year, this process has been under debate all year, is historic. I agree with my colleagues across the aisle, but I'm going to use another word, a six-letter word that I believe characterizes it the best. We absolutely have a debt crisis. There's no doubt about it. In the year 2000, the last year under President Clinton, this country had a $6 trillion federal U.S. debt. At the end of George Bush's presidency, we added $4 trillion, we had a $10 trillion debt. Now, at the end of President Obama's administration, we added $10 trillion to the debt, such that today we end up with $20 trillion of debt on about a $19 to $20 trillion economy. And Mr. President, there are countries under World Bank fiscal watch that have stronger balance sheets than we do today. My concern is this, is that both sides fight each other over this issue depending on who's in the White House and who has a majority in this body. The American people are fed up with it. But I have to say that this bill, what we're talking about doing today, is a con on the American people. Let's talk about what is a con. Over the last 100 years, we've had three political supermajorities. That's where one party or the other has a 60-vote majority in this House, in this body, where they can do basically what they want. 60 times they've had that. I'm sorry, we've had three of those in the last 100 years, all Democratic. The first gave us the New Deal, the second, the Great Society, and the third, Dodd-Frank and Obamacare. Now, I'm just a simple business guy, Mr. President. I've run small businesses. I started working on an hourly wage. I worked my way through college. I ended up running some pretty big company. So my point here is that I can lay at the feet of those three supermajorities most of the responsibility for this financial catastrophe that we have in the United States. It is a full-blown crisis. It didn't just start this year. The annual deficit, they talk about deficits and debt. I talk about debt. That's what we owe the rest of the world. This year, President Trump inherited a budget that this year will produce a $666 billion shortfall between revenues and expenses. And yet, we will collect a record sum of tax this year, the highest in our history. Last year, we collected the most we've ever collected. The year before that, the most. So this has not been a problem of raising taxes, Mr. President. Our problem is very simple, that the size of our federal government has exploded. In the year 2000, the last year under Bill Clinton, the size of this federal government was $2.4 trillion. The size of our government last year under two administrations, one Republican, one Democrat, it was almost $4 trillion. Mr. President, that cannot continue. And yet, since 2009, because of sequestration in the Budget Control Act, the size of our discretionary spending has declined from $1.5 trillion a year to $1.1 trillion a year. And $250 billion of that cutback has been on the back of our U.S. military at the very time when we face more threats and the world's more dangerous than any time in my lifetime. So I'm here today to talk about the con of all cons is the fact that the Great Society and all those sweeping programs, tens of trillions of dollars behind the war on poverty, Mr. President, they failed. Today, the poverty rate in the United States is exactly the same as it was in the late 60s when that was signed into law. Mr. President, doing nothing, the proposal to do nothing, is the con of all cons. The con that bigger government has a solution for the American people has been proven over and over again to fail. Look at Obamacare. We all know, both sides are now agreeing that it's failed. Now what do we do about it is the issue. The Veterans Administration, a cesspool of performance. Obama's stimulus package that was $1 trillion back in 2010 and 11 gave us nothing in terms of economic development. As a matter of fact, the con of all cons is that we're coming out of the slowest, lowest economic growth in United States history, Mr. President, 230 years. Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, bankrupt. U.S. Postal Service, another bastion of success. Amtrak, bankrupt. But I think the greatest thing that we have to do today is get past all that. There are no innocent parties up here. Both sides are guilty when it comes to the $20 trillion problem. The $20 trillion is a manifestation of Washington's unwillingness to get its fiscal house in order and do what every other American has to do, and that is to live within their means. Doing nothing is simply not an option. The last 8 years, Mr. President, under President Obama, we borrowed as a federal government 35% of everything we spent. And what that means is that every dime that we spent on our military, on our Veterans Administration, and on all domestic discretionary programs, Mr. President, is borrowed, because every dime of the $3.5 trillion that we got in last year was spent on mandatory expenses. Doing nothing is not an option. When President Trump took office, though, he said that job one was to grow the economy. Why? Why wasn't growing the economy important? Well, growing the economy is important because it's one of the several steps that you have to employ to get at this debt crisis, Mr. President. Yes, there are going to be some spending, or there are going to be some tax cuts for individuals. We'll get to that in a second. But primarily, this is to be a stimulative package to get the economy growing. There are three pieces to it. One, lower the corporate tax rate. I'm sorry, anybody can debate this and win. We have to become competitive with the rest of the world. In Asia, the corporate tax rate is 18%. In Europe, it's in the low 20s. Getting to 20% in a dynamic situation where everybody is going down, like the UK, and next year we'll go to 17%, Mr. President, this is the least we can do. Getting our pass-throughs to have parity is also critical. But we've got to first roll back federal regulations. That's the first piece. The second piece is we've got to then pull back on or push out our energy potential. We just talked about a few of those, but Keystone Pipeline this year, Clean Power Plan, ANWR are all moving along. But the three pieces of this thing is lowering the corporate tax rate, eliminating repatriation tax, and then a tax cut for working Americans will actually get this economy going. So the other side says, well, wait a minute, you're going to add $1.5 trillion to the debt, okay? I look at it as an investment, Mr. President. And 0.4, as we just heard from my good friend from Pennsylvania, 0.4% will more than pay for that. Well, now, let's look at history. History says that over the last 100 years, 3.5% is our average on GDP, but it's more important than that. In the last 7 decades that we've enjoyed as economic growth in America, only 1 decade have we had lower growth than 2.5%. And that was 1 decade where we had 2.3%. At 2.3%, we more than pay for this, what we're talking about now. And my projection is that we'll do a lot better than, and there are many other people out there, including a noted economist, that say the same thing. But remember, we have $7 trillion, Mr. President, not at work in this economy today because of fiscal policy, not monetary policy. At the very time that the Fed added $4.5 trillion to their balance sheet, the largest in history, we got 1.9% GDP growth over the last 8 years. Mr. President, you can only look at one place, and that's fiscal policy, that would generate that kind of anemic growth in our history. And so what I'm looking at right now is freeing up that $7 trillion. And this tax package is one of several steps that we need to employ that will begin to unleash that capital power. We've got several trillion dollars on the bank balance sheets of smaller and regional banks. We've got a couple $1 trillion on the balance sheets of the Russell 1000 because of uncertainty coming out of Washington. And you've got almost $3 trillion overseas in unrepatriated U.S. profits because of our archaic repatriation tax. Changing this tax code is not only necessary, Mr. President, the rest of the world needs us to do this. But I will say this, under President Trump's leadership and driving force, I believe things are already beginning to happen, and that's why you see reflections in the bond market and the stock market that reflect a moving economy. This economy wants to move. I've watched consumer confidence my entire career, Mr. President, and right now, this is what's happening. So far this year, 2 million jobs have been created. 860 rules and regulations have been reversed, and most of these are onerous things that are sucking the very life out of this free enterprise system. Illegal border crossings are down 60%. 500 people, Mr. President. Now, we voted 97-2 in this body, in the United States Senate, where people say nothing is happening. In a bipartisan vote, we voted 97-2 to allow the head of the Veterans Administration to deal with it like any other entity in the country, and that is to be able to fire people for performance. And since that time, over 500 people have been removed from the Veterans Administration because of lack of performance. Neil Gorsuch was confirmed to the Supreme Court. Consumer confidence at a 16-year high, Mr. President. Things are moving. But this body is still gridlocked, and that's what we've got to break through. What we have here is a historic opportunity to change the direction of our country. This is why I ran for the United States Senate, to be a part of trying to add some influence into a future direction for our children and grandchildren. Mr. President, you realize that our children, this is the next generation, is the first generation in the history of our country that faces a lower economic prospect than their predecessors. That's unacceptable. We're the richest country in the history of the world. We've got the most dynamic worker base in the history of the world. We've got a growing economy again. Mr. President, this is not necessary. So these changes that we're talking about, and I've heard all the rhetoric just today even, just in the last hour. Oh, this is all going to the rich. This is all going to those mean old greedy corporations. And oh, by the way, nothing's going to the little guy. Well, let's talk about the reality here, Mr. President. A family of four, this is a real world example. A family of four earning the median income of $73,000 in this bill will get a 60% tax cut. A single mom with one child making $41,000 a year, which is the median individual income, will get a 75% tax cut, Mr. President. I don't consider those rich. I don't consider those big corporations. Those are individual examples of what this tax bill is intended to do. But more than that, 6 million people who pay taxes today under this bill, next year, their tax rate will go to zero, Mr. President. 6 million Americans will find that they will not be paying federal income tax next year. But the person who gets the biggest cut, the biggest benefit from this entire plan is that person who gets a job, Mr. President. And that's not the half of it. If our corporations get to a competitive position in the rest of the world, and by the way, our 35% nominal tax rate, the top rate for corporations, is the most onerous penalty on the American worker that's been perpetrated by politicians in Washington over the last 50 years, both Republicans and Democrats. This is insanity. The other side talks about insanity. When the rest of the world is almost half of what our corporate rate is, how in the world are we going to defend foreign companies from coming and buying U.S. companies and using the tax arbitrage to pay for it? That's what's happening now. We can end that. This repatriation tax, as I said, will free up almost $3 trillion. Mr. President, this is extremely stimulative in the market. It will improve capital again. It will, I believe, if on the back of an aggressive trade policy, I believe we will get exports growing again. There's no good reason to not be for this bill today. All the false accusations from the other side are just simply not true. Yes, there's an investment here, but every time I bought a piece of equipment in business, Mr. President, I had to pay for it. And I paid for it up front, and I got a benefit from it. It's called a return on investment. And that's exactly what this is for the American worker and the American people. This is an investment, and I expect a return on investment that they will benefit from. This tax code is so archaic, Mr. President, it's embarrassing to talk about. I won't even get, it's 2.4 million words, but it is so ridiculous that this is one of the intents here is to simplify that for the average taxpayer, and I believe we've accomplished that. There are clear problems with this plan, and this plan with the tax program problems today, and this plan takes clear steps to address those. It's an investment in our future. It's a rejection of the idea that 1.9% is the new norm. The other side, a few years ago, tried to convince us that that was the case. If we do nothing, Mr. President, from today forward, this is because of both sides are guilty of this one. The current budget that we're operating under, that was the last budget that President Obama left with us, and we're both guilty of this. This is both sides now. This is not a partisan comment. But $11 trillion, if nothing is done, will be added to a $20 trillion debt. Mr. President, that's just unacceptable. That's not an option. It's not possible. This issue is bigger than partisan politics. It's bigger than self-interest. It's bigger than anyone in this body. This is about our children and our grandchildren. This new tax direction will allow our workers to compete again on a level playing field with the rest of the world and win. And not only is our economic security at risk, Mr. President, I believe that our national security is definitely in danger because of this debt. Both sides are commenting on that today. But don't take my word for it. Almost 200 outside groups have come out in support of this bill. Mr. President, that's historic in its own right. When you do something that's this big, to have that many people support it. I believe that what both sides of the aisle need to do is back up and look at what's best for the American people long term. There are two ideologies at risk here, or at war here, Mr. President. One side believes that we need to give more money to the federal government. Let's have more big programs like the Veterans Administration, the Postal Service, and all of those things, instead of putting it back in people's pockets and investing in our economy. Mr. President, this is a historic moment of opportunity before us this week to change the tax code and to finally help American families and businesses compete with the competitors around the world. This standard of living that we've taken for granted for 70 years is the greatest expansion of economic exercise in the history of humankind. We can turn this around, Mr. President, but only by getting back to the fundamentals of economic opportunity for everybody, fiscal responsibility, limited government, and individual liberty. I believe we'll do it, Mr. President. I believe the American people want us to do it. This President's agenda will work. He comes from the business world, I come from the business world. That's what this is about. We have an understanding of what it takes to compete globally, and that's what this bill does, finally, for the American workers. Mr. President, I thank you, and I yield the floor.